Welcome to the Classical Commons Podcast, a conversation exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform, which connects classical school communities to talent and resources nationwide. Today's guests are two of my colleagues from Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. Both veteran teachers and proponents of classical education, they are currently leading programs to equip the next generation of classical educators. Dr. Andrew Salzmann is an Augustinian. How appropriate that we got you here today, Andrew, on the Feast of St. Augustine. The director of the Center for Classical Studies, Andrew is, and Miss Krystyn Schmerbeck originally began working in public policy, but discovered her vocation as a teacher and a leader in Catholic ed. She currently directs graduate studies in classical education at Benedictine. So welcome, Krystyn and Andrew.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Hey, let's start with a little of the biographical background. Andrew, as I mentioned, you're an Augustinian scholar, and today is the Feast of St. Augustine. So let's St. Augustine. I always struggle with that because I spent some time in Florida, and then I'm calling it Augustine. And what's the proper pronunciation, Andrew? You're the man.
I was always told it depended which side of the Mississippi River you're on.
All right, so we're all west of it. You're in Atchison, and I'm in Phoenix. So what do we do out here in the west?
Augustine.
All right, actually, that's typically how I say it, but I got that Augustine in my head because, you know, I've got a connection over there at Flagler College. Okay, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. What's some real good counsel as we think back, as we remember the great doctor of the church? How would he advise parents and teachers today? Because we're trying to train the young. What do we learn from Augustine?
I love that question. I think for Augustine, he was always a teacher. But at the beginning of his life, I'm not sure he believed in teaching. You know, he talks about kind of going to Rome to be a teacher. The students that he had in his native Africa, he's like, oh, I want better students. I'm going to Rome. He goes to Rome. The students he has in Rome, he's like, they don't take it seriously. But at that time, he's also a skeptic. So he doesn't, his view of what he's doing is very kind of shallow. Like, I'm teaching people rhetoric, but there's no underlying truth. And I think that what Augustine would say is that a good teacher is someone who knows what their students are, who their students are. He grows as a teacher. I think this is true. He grows as a teacher as he comes to understand himself more deeply, the truth about what it means to be a person. So as he kind of discovers, God's word, let's say the logos or the wisdom, divine wisdom, as he discovers that this is real, he becomes a more serious teacher. And he has more that he can give his students. And then as he discovers the need for us to change our hearts through charity, at that point, he becomes a preacher, right? And his sermons are probably his best instruction. So I think as he digs deeper into what it means to be a person, he grows as a teacher. There's this connection for him between seeing the Trinity mirrored in our souls. We're a memory where we hold the truths that we've learned. We're an intellect where we seek wisdom, we seek divine wisdom, we seek Christ in everything that we study. We have a will where we welcome in the Holy Spirit to dwell and to sanctify us. I think as he sees the full picture of the human person, it radically changes what he thinks teaching does. Yeah. And he becomes better at it.
Yeah. And that's good. You don't ask a theologian a broad question and not expect to get a very powerful answer. That's well said, Andrew. Well said. Yeah. We'll take that one to the bank. Krystyn, let me ask you, your website biography says that you traveled far and wide in search of the truth. Like Augustine. Maybe Rome, Milan, I don't know. But tell me, what was the most exotic or distant location that you had to find in this quest? And what was the unexpected destination that that you arrived at the result of this search?
Well, I think the value, right, of hindsight is critical in this question.
Sure.
Because while I have had a great opportunity, I was able to do some evangelical mission work in Iceland at one point. I did a mission trip to Iceland.
Is that right?
I've had great opportunities to travel, usually with students, to great places in Europe to see sort of the depth and history of Western civilization and the Catholic Church. But when I read that question, my immediate answer was, well, when I was getting my public policy degree, I was an intern for almost 2 years at the American Federation of Teachers. And so that was sort of the far and wide, in the sense of I worked with some people who really believed in the ideas. And what I kept coming back to in reflecting upon it was, but our ideas and our actions aren't always the same, or we have a monolithic way of interpreting these ideas and principles that I didn't always quite understand. It opened my mind because I hadn't really been familiar with labor unions or some of their concepts. We focused a lot. I was actually in the Al Shanker Institute doing research for them.
Is that right?
Yeah.
The founder, really, of the charter model, right?
Yes.
Al Shanker was instrumental.
So it's been fascinating, even in that. So that was maybe 20 years ago now. And in those 20 years, even how more radical some of the ideas of teachers unions have become in that 20-year period kind of strikes me. Yeah. Because they sort of started to rub against me at the time when I was looking at how they were being lived out in the individual unions. But at the research level, at the idea level of talking about like labor rights in foreign countries, which is where a lot of their research was focused, or how to bring the idea of democracy and how to forward educational causes in other places. That was a lot of what I spent my time working on. And those are all really laudable goals. And so there was this real tension between these things. And so it was part of what God would later discover I've always wanted to be in teaching, but for a lot of reasons, when I first graduated from college, that wasn't a pathway that was promoted for me. Right. And so, from working in the nonprofit legal sector to being a Starbucks barista to studying public policy and working at the AFT. Then I worked for the Catholic Church and went into the religious life, and then I found teaching. But really, I'd always wanted to be a teacher, and it just seemed like this particular trip at the AFT, that time I spent there in the Research Institute, was a weird way of God being like, don't lose sight of this education thing.
Very interesting. I don't think I knew that you'd spent some time working with the AFT early on. That's really, really striking. And that you were a barista. So, next time we get together, I'm turning to you for the espresso. Andrew and I will be right there.
Bartender ministry is one of my side hustles. I like going into coffee shops and local places and getting to know people and just talk about deeper things.
Yeah. So. Well, let's shift a little bit in this conversation to talk more about classical. That's why we're here, of course. You're both active proponents. I'd really like to know, just again, in the biographical spirit of this conversation, where you first realized that classical schooling really did contain the seeds. This is the stuff, right, which will bring about the kind of renewal we all want in education. Tell me where you were, how it happened. Andrew, we'll start with you, if you don't mind.
I think, maybe looking back, it was inevitable, but in another way, it was very serendipitous. So when I was a freshman in college, I remember in our English seminar, our teacher assigned us E.D. Hirsch, cultural literacy.
Yep.
And I could tell, kind of listening through the lines, that this was the bad guy.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Listening between the lines, I wasn't supposed to like it, but I kind of what he was describing was something I felt, in the sense that people would make allusions. And I was like, what does that? I don't even know what that means. There was people would talk about, the great authors and great works. And I'd be like, I never got to read those. We read some trashy, novel about a post-apocalyptic, woman who survives the nuclear holocaust in my English in high school. Yeah. We didn't read anything meaningful, right? So I read that essay and I was like, wow, this is speaking to me. And
he's onto something.
Pardon?
this Hirsch guy's onto something.
Yeah, he's onto something. And in a lot of ways, I kind of spent my undergrad years trying to like look for and piece together a sense of like, you know, what's the tradition, right? Like what are the things that like I would benefit by knowing, right?
Yeah.
And I found a lot of that in theology, and I took some philosophy classes, and then, you know, kind of fast forward, I had to teach my own kids, and you know, when I was teaching kind of my firstborn math at a younger age, I just kind of like, it really struck me, the idea that like I have to get these things, you know, in his memory before we can really think about it. Like I remember kind of being taught, I don't know, a kind of a former one-room schoolhouse teacher in third grade, and she was very kind of like learn the things. But then after that, I had a more loose education. We did like inventive spelling and stuff like that.
Ooh.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I kind of like come to classical education from the experience of not having had it, right?
Right.
And
well, you're not alone in that. You're not alone in that, Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah. So so teaching my own son math, it really hit home that you have to kind of like deeply internalize the thing, you know, through memory before you can think about it creatively. We were all, I seem to remember we were always being pushed to think creatively. But you have to know something first. So that kind of experience of, you know, what worked with my kids.
Yeah.
And even the joy of giving my kids some stuff that I felt like I worked really hard for. I worked really hard to like find someone to teach me Latin and then to try to learn it. And now I can like, you know, sit down with my sixth grader and go through like Lingua Latina or something. So there's that aspect of it. And in a sense, that way, that's all kind of inevitable. But the thing that was serendipitous, the thing that made me kind of go from being a theologian to a theologian who cares about classical education and does this, you know, to some extent professionally, right?
Yeah.
Is I picked up a book at a library sale from a college that was going out of business, and it was just a generic history of education. And
who's the author there? Andrew, who's the author?
S. Alexander Ripa. I don't know.
Don't know.
It's just a textbook from a history of education class, written in the 70s. And I was wasting time reading it. And I read this. I'm sorry. I'm going to read to you from a book. Is that all right?
Go for it.
Yeah, come on.
But I have it start on the page. He's talking about the history of what we used to think education was. And he says, learning was viewed not as a matter of training. Learning then was viewed, I'm going to get this right. Learning then is viewed not as a matter of training potential and unreformed faculties of the mind, but rather as a process of forming a series of connections or tendencies between situations and responses. So he's going through this history of education, and he's saying, you know, we used to think that there were things called faculties of the mind. And we know that those don't exist. And education is just about kind of like behavioralist kind of like response to stimuli.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, you just described in like, you know, disowning faculties of the mind, you've just kind of like disowned everything I love. You know, I do theological anthropology. I think about like what does a human, what does Augustine say it is to be human? And I kind of like discovered to my like dismay that the history of education of a certain kind or stream of education went all in on the denial of this view of the human person. So that's a kind of a heavily theoretical view of how I got into it. But once you see education as applied anthropology, right? Like once you see that the way you teach a child depends on what you think that child is, then you get what's kind of become our unofficial slogan, maybe official slogan. Like anthropology dictates pedagogy. Anthropology dictates pedagogy. You teach children based on what you think they are. And if you think that they have a soul, you're just going to teach them differently.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, what's so interesting to me, Andrew, is that it seems that there are a handful of cognitive and neuropsychologists as of late. And here I'm thinking of someone like Ian McGilchrist, right, and others, who really are pointing to and using brain science to describe in ways that I find compelling
Really
those
compelling.
very faculties that we dismissed, as you pointed out, under a really reductionist psychology. You know, you mentioned behaviorism. Well, that was because behaviorism was so very limited in its grasp of the mind, the brain, the body, right? So
very blunt. Yeah. And I think we've all benefited from the recovery of like the discourse of habits of mind, you know?
Yep.
And I'm all about, I was reading an excellent book over the summer, The Breakthrough Years, on the kind of cognitive science of kind of what happens in adolescence, because I'm cramming before the exam of my child turning 13.
That's the real exam, the acid test. Yeah, that's right.
But you know, there's a lot in cognitive science that's just you know, illuminative.
Yep.
Once you get over the idea that there's no, you know, once you stop denying that there's an inner life and an inner self.
That's right.
There's a lot of benefit that can come from, you know, the cognitive science of habits of mind.
That's right. Let's come back to that, because I want to talk a little more about what I think we can do at the university level, the college level, to really begin to push the bounds, right, of what we've seen and witnessed in this recovery of classical. So let's hold that, put a little pin in it, as they say. And I do want to hear, Krystyn, from your own experience, you know, when you encountered classical, what were the most striking features that just drew you in, right? They just attracted you.
Well, I mean, when you pose the question that way, the answer is Euclid. I mean, I can't.
There you go.
It's odd. It's truly how it is. How I got there is a weirder thing, but I just, as a teacher, when I did finally get into the classroom, I taught my students the way I had been taught and the way I had learned.
Yep.
And then I realized after about a year of pulling my hair out, maybe 2 years or a year and a half, I was like, okay, they don't get it the way that I got it. But I can't change the entire student body of my classroom. I can only change me. And that sort of sent me on this exploration. And I encountered groups like the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education, CLT, those groups along the way as I had moved into school leadership, continuing to search. Like I was like, there has to be a way to do this better. There has to be a way that's not just my students on a hamster wheel doing homework for 8 classes every night and not having lives. You know, there's got to be a better way. And it's weird because I mean, my undergraduate degree is in classical languages and philosophy. And while I would imagine in other circumstances, if I didn't know better, that I would think, oh, I have a classical education. But in reality, when I went back and I was like, wait, I never read Thomas Aquinas. I never read, there's a whole, like, we read very little Aristotle. There was a very much a mindset at the undergraduate level that the institution I went to, where it was very selective on what authors we read.
Sure.
And so I realized I had a much narrower education than I had imagined. And so then this whole field was opened up to me. But yes, when I was finally, I'd always been a strong proponent of Catholic education and strengthening Catholic education. But the classical component really hit me when I had the opportunity to work and in a certain capacity lead at a Chesterton Academy. And so I was teaching the philosophy to high schoolers and I was teaching Euclid, and it really just exploded and everything kind of became together and integrated. All of the questions I had been asking myself for years, I was like, oh, this is like awesome and so simple, but yet we're having a really hard time doing this. This is fascinating to me.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. You're echoing Andrew's earlier remarks about Augustine, right? The teacher herself, right, is coming to this encounter, is deepening her encounter with the truth. And as such, is able to do that much more, is able to give that much more in the classroom. It's a beautiful thing. And to think that a philosopher, right, ends up being brought closer to the tradition through Euclid. It's beautiful, beautiful story. Okay, we're going to pivot just a little bit because we want to talk about what you're doing at Benedictine. Benedictine at the college level, right? Graduate level instruction, it's designed to focus on subject areas. Oftentimes they're, you know, professional, whether it's medicine or law. In our case, in this case, education. But I want to start by sort of setting the table with what we've learned over the past, say, 2 or 3 decades, because this particular renewal, this particular understanding of classical here in the American context is distinct. It's a distinct movement. What are you emphasizing in the graduate program there at Benedictine to equip the next gen of teachers and leaders with that in mind, with sort of having taken stock, right?
Yeah. I think we probably should both.
We'll probably go back and forth, but yeah.
Please. Yeah, look, that's right. We'll just tag team this.
Maybe one thing that we've learned in the last, 2-3 decades is, I think, in a way, we really did the movement, kind of honed and recovered some methods of teaching in the 90s, let's say, that maybe we had lost, but kind of recovered some older methods of teaching, and especially in like the trivium, let's say. And from that, I think we've grown in a couple ways. I think we've recovered some of the architectonic picture of like what the person is and what education is at a more theoretical kind of thoughtful level, and like joined that to these practices. I also think that we've maybe found a way to take some of the excellent teaching methods that were honed more in the trivium and broaden them into other areas that maybe aren't or weren't as immediately seen as classical. You'll still meet a couple of people today who will say, even people who do classical education, who, if you ask them, what does classical education look like in math or in the sciences, will say, we were having this conversation a couple of months ago, Krystyn, will say, well, I don't really think it exists outside of the humanities, right? So I think that we've kind of recovered and applied some methods of teaching that work really well beyond the humanities. That and maybe that's an area in which we've grown. You can, as our friend Jake Tawney would like to say, there are classics in mathematics, right? There are classic equations, and then there are better ways of solving a problem. There are classics in the sciences. There are kind of quintessential experiments that change the shape of human thought that we can repeat with the students. So to kind of broaden our idea of what a classic is and how we can sharpen our students' education with those classics beyond the strict humanities, I think that's one area of growth over the last 20-30 years.
I want to chime in here real quickly, and Krystyn, you can then piggyback on this, but I think there's something to your earlier remarks, Krystyn, about having taken a philosophy degree and not really having read much Aristotle, let alone Aquinas, when we in these classical schools, especially in the upper grades, the middle and upper grades, right, tend to, as best we can, a representation of the canon, right? The classics that you're referencing, Andrew. And we want to give them an encounter with those classical formulae, right? With those classical drama, the high points, right, from a tradition, so that they don't go off to college or just for that matter, leave their high school experience without having some introduction to this vast panorama of great works, and thus know that there's much out there, and they start to sort of see how this fits together, as opposed to being dropped into that philosophy 101, 201, even 301, and you get just the essentially idiosyncratic rendering of that professor or that grad student because they happen to have an interest in Hegel, right?
I love that so much because I think many of us in college suffered from just what you're saying. Like we learned whatever our professor was writing about that semester, right. At the expense of like a broader account of the tradition.
Sure.
And for me, this is maybe a bit of a tangent. For me, it's exciting to get students who have been already, as before they were freshmen, like introduced to the tradition in a holistic way and have fallen in love with it. It's really, that's changed our college. It's changed Benedictine because a college can only really do, to a certain extent, a college can only really do what its students want to let it do.
Yeah, right.
And
that's a limiting factor. Yep.
Like what we can do with our students has grown so much over the last 9-10 years. I've been doing admissions for the honors program for 12 years now. And over the last 9 or 10 years, we've had just a consistently growing proportion of students from classical schools. That has allowed us to reintroduce a Latin and a classics major. We didn't have one, and we introduced it because the students wanted it. Yeah. We get to do these cool things because the students we receive love the tradition. And the other thing, this is, maybe another angle we don't think about as much. It's been really fun in this master's degree to meet the parents of these students who homeschooled them, or who started the co-op, or who helped launch the school, because you get to meet someone who maybe in college was a nursing degree, a nursing major, but in the pursuit of educating their kids has become just profoundly liberally educated. I get to meet students in the master's program who are as educated, as liberally educated, as well-rounded, as immersed in the Western tradition as any graduate in the humanities in any program that I ever attended. It's beautiful to see kind of that democratization of the tradition.
And it's raising the bar. It's raising the bar in higher ed. That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Krystyn, what about you? What do you take as you reflect on the last couple of decades that we've learned about classical, which you're seeing integrated into the graduate program there at Benedictine?
Sure. Well, and I think the key word there is, as Dr. Salzmann was speaking, and I just think integration is the key. I think part of, as Andy was mentioning about like this shift from the trivium to other topics, talking about Jake Tawney and his, I forget how Matthew Crawford recently said, like, math can be erotic or is erotic. That was like two of the first things. I was like, all right, well, I don't know that I want to lead that into my high school or like secondary classical, like graduate program, but I get his point. And I do love Jake's point about there's something about mathematics that speaks to the soul in a unique way that isn't fulfilled unless you study and really study math, and not just the application or routinization of math. Right. And so there's two things that keep coming up again and again to me. And I think that they stem, and fortunately and unfortunately, we're in this really interesting phase here where a lot of our Benedictine students and our graduate students are enamored with, the history of the integrated humanities program at KU. We have a good friend in Bishop Conley from Nebraska. And we were fortunate to have him here last spring. He came to visit, or February. So that comes up again and again. And the putting education in the real. So the idea of getting students outside, right? The idea of nature study, but also the integration across things, that I can do narration in my science class about the history of science, and I'm studying both history and science, and I'm grounded in the real. So it's triple the impact for one lesson. There's just this narrow way in which, a more contemporary or modern mindset about education is very much bucketed. It's like, okay, this is history and this is English and this is science and this is math, and everybody's separate. And one of the challenges, even when I was working in diocesan schools, was breaking down those silos, because there weren't common spaces in the schools for faculty to be. And so then when you go to a place like a Chesterton, where it's a one office faculty room, like every faculty member has a desk in one room. Right. That's saying the integration starts. You know what I mean? Like, but it's this integration component, I think, is what makes classical education so rich, because we don't have to compartmentalize our lives into, well, I'm not a math person. Well, no.
I love that answer. And I think it points to something that a great educator and a friend of ours, Catherine Newmeyer, would like to say. Which is, I think that over the last 20 or 30 years, we've come to appreciate a lesson that maybe TAC would have wanted us to learn sooner, which is the importance of like an integrating philosophy, a kind of like an emphasis not just on the experience of beautiful classics and beautiful things, but an attentiveness to asking like what is true and why is it true, and the kind of the philosophical foundation and the philosophical habits of mind that we want to imbue in our students.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I was struck. I think that's, with the work from places like ICLE kind of spreading in Catholic schools. And I was struck by Jane and Clark's book that came out, in the last couple of years, where, they give such a strong role coming out of the ACCS tradition to philosophy as well. So I think maybe there's the kind of a convergence on the importance of fostering philosophical habits of mind as well.
Yeah, and lest our listeners, viewers think that when you use the word philosophy, we're talking about something disconnected. This is philosophy that really does have practical implications.
Right. Yeah. And in terms of the habit of mind of thinking things through analytically and and pursuing, kind of an ability to account for, not just the beautiful and the good, but the true.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're saying.
Yeah, can I cover that though real quick though, Rob? I just want to jump in too, because I think it's not purely philosophical, or I guess it depends on how we're using that word, but also the idea of the religious in sort of a generic sense truth, going back to anthropology, that man is made for transcendence, that there is something beyond. And that's one thing that a modern or contemporary approach to education in a public system might miss.
Yeah.
Right. By failing to integrate, part of the integration is orientation towards something more, that they go together.
Yeah.
And that's the real liberal and liberal arts. Yeah.
Well, that's right. And the fact that the arts are complementary, right? I mean, my mind immediately goes to these sort of applied ways in which drawing increases my attention, which could be used in the biology classroom as I'm preparing to dissect the frog, et cetera, right? I mean, there's just ways in which I think we have opportunities to move the classical tradition forward in our moment by showing that integration, which is philosophically grounded. So I think you're both just sort of, flip side of or two sides of the same coin. So
can I take that jump off point to talk a little bit about one of my favorite parts of our graduate program?
Yeah,
because I've been talking about. Yes, we have a sequence of classes that's particular to pedagogy, and we do address the different sort of traditional topical areas, partially because we envision ourselves both meeting sort of teachers who are rediscovering the classics and maybe already think about education in a sort of subject matter mindset, but also because there's specific things about science, but then there are unifying things. And so when you talk about these drawings, it made me think specifically of how we do projects that are extremely concrete. In our science methods class this fall, I know for a fact that the teacher is going to assign students to nature journal for the entire length of the class. So our teachers are going to be nature journaling as part of their graduate education. I don't make, if I'm going to tell the teachers that their students ought to be doing something, or they ought to lead their students in it, it's almost always the case that I've assigned an assignment where the teacher themselves has to do it. I've assigned teachers to do a read aloud where they have to record themselves reading aloud a text, like sort of in an animated fashion. And then they have to watch themselves and sort of, did I pause? Did my voice change? Right? How would this be compelling? And then I invite them to do it in a class and see what happens. Right. But it's about developing these skills that used to come naturally and that many people have because they're parents. Honestly, if you're a parent, you have an opportunity to reach your child, your children delight more when you use silly voices.
That's right.
Right. And so that's what I love about our course, because it takes some of these, timeless tricks and of the trade, as it were, but they're really just the heart of the trade, the heart of the craft of teaching. And we create in a way where teachers are, in a certain sense, forced, because, they're trying to learn, they want to get the grade, but they're forced to do things that we wish they had done in third grade.
Well, that's it, right? Because as we've virtually all confessed, I'm not going to tell my story right now because we don't have the time, but effectively we've all come to this as one late born, if I can borrow the phrase.
Sure.
And as such, we realize I didn't have that formation. So how then am I going to give that to my children, right? Or to my students? Well, we're going to have some experience, some encounter, something of the practices, right, of this pedagogy, so that we can pass it along to the next gen. So I think you're absolutely onto it with a pedagogy course that, and I came through an educational grad school, and I remember what those courses were, and they were not anything like what you're describing, right? And how many times do I talk to graduate students who've gone through an education program in history or in science or mathematics, and they've only taken 1 or 2 courses in the discipline. Never mind that they haven't done anything pedagogically that really is pertinent to the teaching of history, the teaching of science, the teaching of mathematics. So I think we've got a wide open field here, which is where I want to go next. You're in higher education, and these institutions historically have been the source of research, and you've got grad students now. So what are some topics or areas of interest that we should expect future research in exploring classical education?
This is such a rich field, and I wish Albert Chang were here.
Yeah, that's right.
Because
a colleague from the University of Arkansas. That's right.
Right. I think they're doing a lot of wonderful work there, but I would go even, I think there's been calls by a lot of people to have another good soil report from the ACCS and to do something similar as we see this trend growing in terms of how this is going forward. But I think the reality is that these methods work. And one of the things is in the science of reading and in doctoral programs in math education, the research that the secular world is producing confirms what classical education is known for millennia. So I don't know if we need a ton of new research in classical education, because since the human person is at the center of education, regardless of your philosophy toward education, one of the things I'm noticing is when I read secular research that's well done, it's actually reinforcing things that I already know to be true from a philosophical perspective of the human person, just like we were talking about earlier. But I think there's this sense of, the question we grapple with, and again, I think the best questions in classical education aren't going to lend themselves to easy research. Like how much great books reading is too much in a semester? Like where is the balance between
There's a tipping point, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is the fighting point. Do we read? You think about the tension between like the festina lente. What does that really mean? How would I quantify festina lente or give it more depth?
Yep.
Because I think that does matter, especially because of the cultural moment we're in, right? If Chesterton's right and education is simply the handing on of a culture from one age to a next, then there are certain things from our current modern culture we don't want to hand on. And I think one of them, in addition to the fragmentation, which you've addressed through integration, is the frenetic pace. What does true leisure, what does true scholae look like? And how does that contribute to our intellectual growth and the development of these habits?
Sure.
We think about it in exercise science. I don't know if you guys lift at all. I love to learn about lifting. I try to lift heavy weights. I'm not very good at it yet, but I do a lot of research, and rest is critical for the development of your muscle tissue
that's right.
in between heavy lifting.
It's a beautiful analogy. Yep.
So how could it not be the case that the same is true intellectually? And how do we accommodate that in a system that's maybe not designed for that output?
Yeah, I've often wondered, right? I've worked in classical schools, and I've watched them power through, right? 30 works on, canonical works that they're going to get through this year. Right. And, 2 hours a day, right? Yeah. Every day of the week. And I'm thinking, all right, just make sure there's some space in there. There's some space in there. Even Mortimer Adler, who was, one of the proponents of this from the last century, was saying, maybe every other day you want to be able to explore the work. So we could use some research to find that sweet spot where reading at the right pace, as you say, making haste, but, slowly. Right. And with leisure would actually help students to retain more. But I love your comment about running counter to the frenetic, constant 24/7, every day of the week. Where is that space for leisure, let alone Sabbath? We've got a real opportunity here to put forward an alternative vision, right, for how to live well, how to flourish. Now, I also, Krystyn, want to just piggyback on the idea that we could glean a lot from research that's being done well in other disciplines, but we actually need scholars like yourselves, Andrew, Krystyn, to get out there and do the gleaning, right? And then do some of that, meta research, if you will, by gathering it up and presenting it. And I always like to make a plug, since I'm involved on the editorial board at Principia, that's a journal dedicated to classical ed.
Right.
Krystyn, Andrew, I invite you as a sub-editor, please submit some of that meta research, like show us where the good stuff is happening outside of classical that's applicable, right, to the work we're doing in these schools.
So I really liked Krystyn's answer. It does a nice job of showing her strengths in thinking about the craft of teaching, how to apply, kind of brain science and other kind of quantitative research to understand why it is that classical education works well. That's a real strength she brings to our program. And I especially, you reference Albert Chang and his great work in kind of giving the kind of research that policy analysts are looking for. I think there's another side, if I was to like raise my hand for the humanities,
sure,
of research that we also kind of push our students to look into, which is like to remember that although classical education is a movement, and we've kind of articulated to ourselves principles of what the classical movement looks like, it's also a historical reality. And so one of the things that we push to do in our summer courses is to kind of like read the tradition, to have contact with the tradition, to see like what did people in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, what did the Jesuits, what did education actually look like? What practices, what ideas did they have? So that we don't, I think that kind of like forcing ourselves to be answerable to the tradition as it exists helps us to remain grounded in what the tradition really is, instead of saying, well, I think that classical education must have been like or should be like kind of a priori definitions of what classical education is in an ideological way. And so one of the things I've enjoyed, and that our students in the summer course where we do the history of education have said they benefited from, is just kind of like a walk through the history of classical education, great texts from the classic and the medieval eras, where we kind of, at the Renaissance especially, where we kind of see like, this is what we did as a tradition. If you look back at Renaissance education, it was in Latin, right? But they read in high school, maybe one class you'd go through 20 lines, So the idea that you have to do a mad dash from you can be kind of liberated from the idea that you have to do a mad dash through a bunch of canonical works, if you teach in a different kind of festina lente kind of way. So one of my kind of like discoveries over the summer that I was excited about was, we were reading the grammar commentary by Isidore of Seville.
Yeah.
And he makes a connection between grammar and history. And so you get this kind of critique of one of the founders of classical education, Dorothy Sayers, and her association of grammar and history, maybe. But actually, you find out like there's something in the tradition that bolsters her insight, kind of pretty deeply. So.
That's right.
So there's also that kind of possibility for research that does a resource mod.
That's right. Well, and I'm all for it, Andrew. I know you're a Hugh of St. Victor guy, and I've taught that one myself, right? So I think we do well to get back to those primary sources. We're also blessed, right, to have the Peter Browns of the world, the H.I. Maroos, the Mary Carruthers. There's a good bit of solid research, secondary scholarship that helps to give guidance when you're trying to figure out how do I make sense of Victor's work, right? Of the Didascalicon. So I think this may be, we may be on the cusp, right, of a golden age of recovery of research of that tradition, but read it and get into it and understand it on its own merits. I think you're absolutely right. So we're just going to kind of wrap this one as we think about how the program is developing there at Benedictine. You've been a couple years at it, and as you enter this third year, I'd love to know what you're learning, what you're seeing on the ground, and really kind of where you're headed in the next couple of years as you watch this and you help this program really to evolve and meet the needs of teachers and leaders.
Right. And it's been pretty interesting. So we graduated our first 5 graduates in May of 2026. 2 of those were in our classical education
25.
graduate program.
25, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My years.
This summer.
This summer, I know. It's been a crazy time here at Benedictine. We're so blessed.
Festina Lente.
So 5, 2 from our classical education program, 3 from our classical leadership track. 4 of those 5 were made job offers in the field. So we're very, very excited about that. And the one who didn't is a stay-at-home mom, and it's great. It will be doing future things in education, I am sure. She's working on some scholarly projects. So we have now about 50 students total in our program. And we've got 9 really seasoned educators in our current classical education cohort. 7 of them are full-time, and they'll be graduating in the spring. And we also have about 14 students in our classical leadership track that are about to graduate. Like, we have 10 to 14 that are going strong there. And then we just added almost 40 students this summer.
Wonderful.
Between the 2 programs. So we're really excited about the growth we're seeing. And we're really getting students from coast to coast. And we have at least 1 student at Great Hearts. We have 2 or 3 students that work in classical Christian spheres. We do predominantly have Catholic school students, teachers and leaders, as well as a number of homeschooling educators. And all of that rich experience. We have a small, we were trying to think about this idea of refugee teachers based on some of the research that come out recently. We really only have 1 or 2 that might qualify for that, in terms of they had been in public education, but they shifted a long time ago. They're not new converts to this idea. And so it's been really wonderful. We're seeing both a desire from young people who are just graduating with their content degrees and wanting to know how to teach, as well as seasoned educators who are like, this is what I've been waiting for. Where have you been for the last 5 years? So it's been really a treat. And what we're learning is our students in some ways are our best asset. They come with so much knowledge and eagerness and curiosity. And so we're having a hard time keeping up with how amazingly energetic they are at times. And it's been fun. Our summer intensives, I know it seems like a hard reach to be like, well, why do I have to take 2 weeks of a class in person? Those 2 weeks each summer are revolutionary, and they create a cohort feeling. You have now an entire network at your hands. It's like doing classical commons on a small scale in person, right? Building these networks of current and future leaders who are going to be part of this renewal for decades to come.
I witnessed one of these at another institution of higher education, our colleagues down at the University of Dallas, early inception. And it was so formative. Just having those 2 weeks on campus. These are teachers who have lives and families, and they made great sacrifices. But because they came together, the kind of esprit de corps, right, their common purpose was just so powerful. And as you said, Krystyn, it's a network, an instant network, and that sort of magnification of the experience of those who are in the trenches, sharing that together and coming out of that experience saying, okay, we can do this, and we can do it better as we work collectively in common, right? So
it's a lot of fun to see people who are, maybe, curriculum officers at their school in class kind of debating or working through or grappling with this is how we have structured our curriculums, this is how we've answered this problem or this challenge. And just to see the kind of the cross-pollination between the best ideas that they bring to the table just amongst themselves. So
that's great. So what should we be expecting in the next year or 3 from Benedictine? What are we looking for? I mean, we've got those 40 that just came in the tank, right? So that's plenty to be busy with. But what should we be on the lookout for? What should our audience be watching for?
Andy, what do you think? Do you have a big idea? I mean, we're doubling down on our mission. I was thinking about how if you're taking a graduate program and you don't have 2 or 3 of your colleagues from the program that you don't have on speed dial for your next problem, then you need to find a program. Benedictine College is always about educating men and women in a community of faith and scholarship. And what I love about our program is how our graduate programs, although they're distance programs and they're online during the school year, we've been able to cultivate that kind of community. And that's been transformational. So we want to build on that and really continue to deepen our understanding and give these students a true encounter with the tradition.
Yeah.
Is there any way our audience can kind of peek in, take a look, get a little snapshot of what you're doing? Because I mean, if there's anything, publications or otherwise, maybe webinars, I don't know. Maybe we have to set it up here with your help. But, what are they going to be able to see and learn about Benedictine? That's what I really want to share with them.
Sure. Well, we are developing a newsletter this year. We'll be having some scholarship from our faculty in the Sheridan Center that will cover a wide range of topics, either specifically on a work in the tradition or on pedagogical methods or just about classical education as a movement.
Yep.
Certainly, we're going to be getting better at, we've been very fortunate to bring some great scholars to our campus and to add to our own sort of stores of adjunct faculty. So we'll be hoping to get them more out there. We are also working to develop some undergraduate programming that could equip people who might want to graduate and go and right into classical education in terms of minor studies. So
that'd be great.
So there's a lot of that being developed. Andy, thoughts?
I mean, another thing that we're particularly blessed with is, we have a very solid working relationship. Although we're not part of the Department of Education, the education department on campus, we have a very good working relationship with the education department, and they've kind of helped us to, for example, our degree is technically an education degree. It's registered with our accreditor as an education degree, and that comes with some benefits for professional formation and stuff like that. And in our kind of greatest hopes, we've been working on some pathways where for teachers who could benefit from it, or from administrators who could benefit from it, they might be able to kind of take a couple extra classes in addition to our master's degree through Benedictine, and get principal licensure, teacher certification. So that's an outstanding project that we're hoping to kind of firm up.
So there's a lot of good things coming out of Atchison, Kansas, and we're going to keep our eyes on y'all. We're going to stay in touch. I'm going to hear from you regularly, and then maybe we'll set up the webinar to just kind of do the reveal. The next project or program that comes online, we want to tell folks all about it here at Classical Commons.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Rob. That would be awesome.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Krystyn.
Thank you very much.
Great conversation. I apprget your time. Have a great week.
We'd love to have you on campus, actually. Maybe that's what we should do.
We'll do that. Next steps. All right. We'll get to it.
Awesome.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Rob.